Hi, my name is Martin Purnell, and welcome to Off-Grid Christianity, a weekly podcast for those who go or don't go to church and where we can meet and hear from those that have made the faith count. This podcast series is to encourage via conversation. You can contact us as well by email, ogc@accessradio.biz, and biz is spelt B-I-Z. Today's guest is an author, speaker, and as well as being a family man, was one of the BBC's main news items last Christmas Day. Our guest is the founder of Care for the Family, which now employs over 70 staff. He is about to go on tour in June, sharing just some of his life-to-date stories. So how and why did our guest start up Care for the Family? What were the pressures he faced and felt at this time? What did his family think? His book, A Knock at the Door, featured heavily on the BBC website over Christmas. How did the Beeb get involved? And looking back on his life to date, what has he learned about himself and God? It gives me great pleasure to welcome today Rob Parsons. Rob, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Martin.
Let's go for it, good sir. 5 important and maybe not so important questions to ask you first of all, just to get a better flavour of who you are. Question number 1. If you could invite anybody from history for an evening meal, alive or dead, so that you could ask them questions, who or would it be?
Gosh, there's so many, aren't there? But I had a wonderful privilege once. I was showing around Robben Island, and I got separated in South Africa from the tour. And for a moment, I was on my own outside Nelson Mandela's cell. Just looked in there through the bars across the bay to the Table Mountain and his Bible by the side of his bed. And it was an incredible experience. And I'd love to have dinner with Nelson Mandela. Just the most incredible man. Lots of trouble he'd been through, and obviously went through a stage of his life that was incredibly challenging. But no, for me, it would be Nelson Mandela.
You're not the first person to choose Nelson.
No.
But obviously, you'd have to cook him a meal as well. So having brought him back in my time machine, you're going to cook him a meal. What would it be?
Oh, I'm a big pasta guy. I've only really started cooking myself in the last 18 months. But I do enjoy cooking now. I do him a pasta. I don't know if he'd like that. I should probably do him a barbecue. But no, we'd eat pasta together.
That'd be very good. Question 2. Who is your favourite biblical character or favourite biblical story or favourite parable, please, good sir?
Oh, well, I think that's pretty easy. About 20-odd years ago, I was invited to speak to about 5,000 people who had a day of prayer in the National Exhibition Centre in Birmingham. Uh-huh. They were praying for prodigals. I was asked to speak, and I had a message on prodigals in my pocket. But when I got there, they erected a huge cross at the front of the auditorium. And during the day, they invited people to come and lay the names of their prodigals at the foot of the cross. And after an hour, they asked me to leave the stage and come and stand by the cross and pray with people. But Martin, by the time I got there, there were thousands of names at the foot of the cross. And it seemed that the pain of the world was there. And I remember God laying on my heart that day an incredible sense of his heart for prodigals. I never did get to preach the message on my pocket. I preached something else and eventually came out in a book I wrote and a tour all over the world. So my favorite parable and story is that parable of the prodigal son. When I studied English literature years ago, the professor who, as I understand it, had no Christian faith, she said, I think it may well be the greatest short story ever told. And my favorite bit of it is this. And when he was a long way off, the father saw him and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the boy began his speech, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you, and I'm no more worthy. But he never got to finish it. The father says, put a robe on his back and a ring on his finger and shoes on his feet. My boy's home. So for me, parable of the prodigal son.
Great answer. And I think that's one of the top 3 answers we get on this. And it's only been recently, actually, that someone said, well, we ought to call it a prodigal father, really, because he was breaking the mould by running for a start, which he shouldn't do.
He was, yeah.
There's so much to read into that.
No, it really is, yes, amazing.
And, of course, the old joker, and who was the most disappointed to see the prodigal son return?
The fatted calf.
Correct.
Yeah.
Question 3. If you were Prime Minister for the day and could change any law or impose a new law, what would it be?
I would do anything, I think, to give more dignity to elderly people who feel they have no power and loneliness. If I could introduce some kind of law that would bring companionship and hope to people who are shut in on their own. Some years ago, Dan and I settled down to watch a television program and our phone went. It was a landline then. And Dan picked it up and she said, oh, I'm sorry, I think you've got a wrong number. And the dear old lady on the end of the phone said, my dear, please don't hang up. You're the first person I've spoken to this week. And I get the impression, Martin, that that woman just dialed numbers until she got somebody that she could talk to. So if I could change anything, loneliness is a great killer. We live in a world where we have more communication than ever, and people are lonelier than ever. I sometimes feel that care for the family stands in the shoes of the extended family. You know, when I was a kid, we were brought up in a street. None of the houses had an inside toilet, running hot water, or bathroom, but they had community, and they looked after each other. So if it was possible to wave a magic wand in legislation, it would be something along those lines.
Very good. Question 4. What has been your most enjoyable day out so far, please, Rob?
I went to South Africa. I go to South Africa about once a year. I've been going for 20 years. And speak there, and sometimes get the opportunity to visit orphanages. But on one trip, I went on a safari, and it was incredible. It's a little scary. It was a real safari, so it wasn't like like Longleat. And I remember one day we went out looking for elephants, and we couldn't find any. And then at the end of the day, the elephants found us, and they didn't look very happy to have come across us. So I think just to be near nature like that is incredible. I see my next question is my most embarrassing moment. So let me tell you that, because it happened on that safari. I was on the Jeep with about 8 or 9 other people, and it was the first time I'd been in that kind of situation. And my long distance is not great, and other people were spotting animals at a distance. There's a warthog, there's an impala, and suddenly I shout out, "Tiger!" The warden said, "Gosh, you must have good eyesight. The nearest one is 3,000 miles away in India."
Yeah.
So that was a bit embarrassing.
What did you want to say?
Lion. No, I thought I saw a tiger. That was I actually thought I saw a tiger.
Well, maybe you did. Maybe it escaped from a zoo somewhere. And
Maybe it had. Well done. Good job.
yes, well spotted. Your eyesight was absolutely spot on. Eagle vision.
You and my mother would have got along just fine. She thought I could do no wrong as well. So thank you. Yeah.
Let's move on then. So for those that like listening to accents, they might pick up from your accent, Rob, that you've got a slight Welsh lilt.
Yeah.
Where were you born, good sir? And where are we speaking to you at the moment?
I was born in Cardiff in South Wales. I lived there all my life, apart from a spell living in away when I went to law college in Guildford. I'm speaking now from our headquarters at Care for the Family, which is in Newport, which is about 10 miles outside of Cardiff. So really spent all my life in this area.
So let's talk, if that's okay, about yourself. And before you set up Care for the Family, you've already mentioned that you went to Guildford. What was your school days like?
They were, I think, traumatic in some ways. Primary school was okay, but I was sick a lot. So I didn't do very well in primary school. And then I really, really wanted to go to grammar school to pass the 11 plus. But it was Oscar Wilde who said there are 2 great tragedies in life. One is not to get the desire of your heart. The other is to get it.
Yeah.
And I got the desire of my heart. But the second I arrived in that school, I knew I'd made a dreadful mistake. It was like being in an alien country. These kids had books in their homes, and we only had 3 books in our house. We had a Bible that nobody read. We had an atlas and something called the Doctor's Book, which was so written that whatever disease you looked up, you had. And my parents couldn't help me. My mother could read and write, but not much more than that. And suddenly I'm in this school, and I just feel rubbish. And I think my lowest moment came when I was 14 in the Easter exams, when there were 34 kids in my class, and the teacher used to read out the results, beginning with the kid that came top. It was a system designed both to honor and humiliate. And I remember as we got into the 30s, my heart began to pound, and finally there were just 2 names left. And I looked across at Bernard Harris, and he looked at me, and then I heard Bernard's name. And 33 sets of eyes turned to look at the stupidest kid in the class. And when he wrote in my report that term, my teacher wrote these words, and I've still got it. In fact, I reproduced it in my new book. He wrote, "Disgraceful. He's making no use of what little ability he has." And so I just felt rubbish academically, and that didn't improve all the time I was in school. And it's incredible how strong the messages you get when you're kids, how much they affect you all your life. So my grammar school experience wasn't great, to be honest. No.
Any ideas what happened to Bernard Harris?
No, bless his heart, no. I sometimes wonder what happened to the form teacher. You know, he was a bit of an actor, really, and as he got near the 30s, used to read them out, used to slow down for a bit of dramatic effect. It was as if this was the Colosseum and he was Nero. Some poor sucker was going to die. So I've often wondered what what happened to those people.
Yeah.
We used to have things called O-levels then.
Yeah.
The precursors of GCSEs. And I remember coming home with my results. I passed 3.5. The half was for special arithmetic, which was for kids who couldn't pass O-level maths, but could at least count. And that was a half on O-level. And then English language, English literature, and history. And I came back with another guy, and he passed 2.5. And I was at a school reunion dinner some years ago, and I saw this guy that had got the 2.5. And he went up to one of the teachers and he said, "Do you remember me?" He said, "No, I don't." He said, "Well, my name's Roy. I've got a master's degree from Oxford University in law. I'm a barrister, and I've written the definitive work on law in prisons. And you said I'd be a failure." And he said, "Oh, did I, Roy?" And in fact, some years ago, I was lecturing in Bristol University to about 200 lawyers. And during the interval, I went upstairs to see whether a rumor I'd heard was true. So I went upstairs, I wandered along the corridor of the law department, and there on the doors was written lecturer, senior lecturer. And then I get to one mark, professor of law. And I knock the door and I go in, and there he is, sat with his feet on the table as he used to in maths. And I said, "Hey, Roy, you failure." And we laughed like drains. You never know what's going to happen in life. But even so, those messages we get. And I speak about that a lot these days. And very often, teachers are my heroes. I get teachers coming up to me and say, "Thank you for telling those stories. It's a good reminder how powerful the messages we give kids are."
Yeah, exactly. What was it like then growing up in the area, especially just outside Cardiff where you were brought up by your parents?
It was great. The fascinating thing is, and I don't really understand this, by any standards, we were poor. I mean, we didn't have an inside toilet. We didn't have running hot water. We didn't have a bathroom. We didn't have a toilet. We didn't have toilet paper. We used to have the local South Wales Echo newspaper ripped up into pieces. We only had one source of heating in the whole house. So by any standards, we were poor, but I didn't feel poor.
Yeah.
We had everything we needed. The house was freezing in the winter, but then you lit the fire and you climbed into bed. My father used to be a postman. So in the winter, my mother would say, "Well, put a coat on the bed," and used to keep his old overcoats. As a postman, you got given an overcoat about once every 2 years, and he'd keep the old ones and we'd use them on the bed. But I didn't feel poor. And we played games. And the fascinating thing is, in those far off days, I'd be 9, 10 years old, and we'd go off for the day up in the woods. And, my parents wouldn't see us for 7 or 8 hours probably in the summer holidays. And yet today it would be unthinkable to do that. My childhood in the street where I lived was happy, and my home was secure, and I was very grateful for that.
That's a good building block for what's going to happen in the rest of your life and starting up care for the family, of course.
My dad was a difficult man in many ways. He was unusual. He never told me he loved me, never praised me. He never hugged me. He used to say, "A mother for love, a father for discipline." And after he died, I went into his bedroom and I opened his wardrobe door. I would have no more thought of doing that when he was alive than breaking into Fort Knox. And
Yeah.
I discovered his old army papers. And I discovered that my mild-mannered father, the postman, was part of Winston Churchill's Special Operations Executive in the war.
No.
These men and women were parachuted into enemy lines sometimes, or behind enemy lines into France and Belgium. He was in the signals, did Morse code. And my mother said when he came back from the war, he was a changed man, but he never, ever spoke of it. But I came to believe as a young child that although my dad wasn't an emotional man, he was always there. He was like a rock. And if the chips were ever down, he'd be there for me.
Yeah.
And my mother, she loved, but she also accepted. And that's, people sometimes think that love is the greatest gift in the world, and it is. But there's another gift, Martin. And if this gift is not given, a husband, a wife, a partner, a child, a friend will never believe they're loved. It is the gift of acceptance. So my mother accepted me. She loved me, but whether I came first or last, whether I came top or bottom, I knew I was accepted. And so that's a very powerful thing. So it was in many ways a very stable childhood, and I'm grateful for it.
Well, you mentioned there Special Operations Executive, or the SOE. I just devour anything to do with World War II, because if it wasn't for those amazing people, I wouldn't be here today, for instance. What have you found out about your dad and what he actually did?
Well, he was a special operator. His captain said he showed incredible courage under the most difficult circumstances, but he never spoke of it. In fact, I had somebody working on his war records a couple of years ago, and then they suddenly died. They were an older person. I've got some information, but not a great deal. Do you know, at home, we used to have what he called the wireless,
Mm.
and it was always tuned to the home service, what he called the home service. But some nights he'd fiddle with the knobs and he'd get Morse code, and then he'd write it down. And I remember one night saying to him, "Where'd you learn to do that?" And he pointed a bony finger at my face and said, "Careless talk costs lives." He never, ever spoke of it. I found in his army papers a handwritten notes of French villages, just a list of them in pen. And a friend of mine traced those villages and the course of some of the battles and so on. So, I mean, these people were brave beyond, weren't they?
Oh, incredible.
Incredible.
Yeah, absolutely amazing people. Sometimes they, as you know, they will open up and share later on, but other times they just won't.
It was almost as if it was either too traumatic or too holy in some ways to talk about. But I think it was drummed into my dad, certainly, that you just didn't talk about it. It was dangerous to do it, so you just didn't say anything. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you for telling me that. Looking forward to hearing more about him in years to come, if they can find any more history on him, because I just want to doff my cap to people like that. Thank you. We're getting up to about 16 years of age then, so obviously you've got the world is your oyster. What decision did you want to make and what actually happened?
Well, when I was 16, I'm about to drop out of school. I'm about to drop out of church. I'd started to go to a church on the corner of my street, but I didn't really understand. All I wanted was to be a rock and roll singer.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I'm walking down the road one day and I got a guitar over my shoulder that I can't play very well. And I've just started a band called the Blue Jets. Our drummer went on to play for a group called Amen Corner, who had several...
No! Andy Fairweather Low? If Paradise Was Half As Nice, in brackets.
Right. Yeah, that's it. A couple of years after that, I was watching BBC Top of the Pops, which was the big music show.
Yeah.
And there's Amen Corner and Dennis Bryan, our drummer, playing on telly. And he went on to drum for the Bee Gees later. And in fact, a couple of years ago, I discovered he'd written his autobiography. It was called You Should Be Dancing, My Life with the Bee Gees. And there was a little bit about the Blue Jets in there, which was nice at the beginning. He was very complimentary about our musical ability, but nevertheless, we were in there. But all I wanted is to be a rock and roll singer. And I'm walking down the road one day, and I got a guitar over my shoulder, I got ice blue jeans on, an Elvis Presley-style haircut. I'm about to drop out of school. And I meet an older guy from our church called Arthur Tovey. Arthur and his wife Margaret were poor. They lived in 2 rooms in his mother's house. Arthur had never passed an academic exam in his life, and they were told at that time they could not have children of their own. But they loved kids, and they worked with young people in the church, in that little church on the corner of my street. And he said to me, "Rob, next Wednesday night, Margaret and I are starting a little Bible study in our home for teenagers. Would you like to come?" Well, Martin, when all you want to do is be a rock and roll singer and walk on the stage in Las Vegas dressed in gold lame, a Bible study on a Wednesday, not the greatest offer you've ever had.
No, not really.
But I said, yes. And for some reason, I went along to that thing. And he was very clever. He knew we'd get bored with the religious stuff. So after about 25 minutes, he said, time for table tennis. And I look around this tiny room, and I think tiddlywinks would be a challenge. And then there's a big banging on the stairs, and he and Margaret bring down some hardboard. They put it on top of the table. They produce a couple of bats, a net, a ball, and we play ping pong with the bats up against our chest. And then he bought us fish and chips. And as the vinegar was seeping through the paper coming back from the shop, Margaret would have the tea brewing. And you know, Martin, when you walked into that home, you felt like a king. No matter what teacher said about you, Arthur told you were special, that God had given you gifts. And in fact, when I was about 16, 17, he said, "I think God has given you a gift of public speaking, and I'm going to teach you." Now, that was scary because Arthur was the worst public speaker you've ever heard in your life. And he taught me to teach the parable of the prodigal son to children. That's interesting, some what you and I have just been talking about. And so I began to speak a little. Now, when I was in my 30s, the Law Society of England and Wales asked me to be a keynote speaker in front of 1,000 lawyers at their annual conference in Vienna. And before I went on stage, I rang Arthur. And I said, "Arthur, I'm about to go on stage, 1,000 lawyers out there." And he said, "Oh, my Robert, I'll be saying a little prayer for you." I said, "Thank you." I said, "Arthur?" "Yes," he said. I said, "You taught me to do this." He said, "Did I?" And as he was dying, I went into the hospital and he was almost comatose, but I put my lips next to his ear and I whispered, "Arthur, thank you. You changed my life." And he kissed me. And he did, because you know what happened is he got me talking to kids. And one night there was a lawyer at the back listening. And he came forward and said, "You're pretty good on your feet. I'd like you to join my law practice." And that changed everything.
Wow. A few weeks ago, a previous guest called David Oliver, we were talking about grief. In fact, we're going to be doing a proper sequel to that in a few weeks' time. As you might be aware, he's just written a book on grieving.
Yeah.
And one of the things that he said that meant such a lot to him, when he was just sitting there, what do I do? There was a knock on the door and it was you. Do you remember what happened?
Yeah, I just went to see them and spend time with them. And by the way, his book on grief is an amazing book. An amazing book. I highly recommend it. I just went to see them, and you know, I think I said something like this to them. Look, I honestly don't know what to say. The problem is, you should you say this or should you say that? So I'm just coming to tell you that I care and spend a bit of time with you and pray with you. And it was a very precious time. I'm glad I went. But you know, grief is an incredible thing. People, when they're talking to people who have known great grief, they tend to make a couple of mistakes. And we've all done it. You say something like time will heal, but time doesn't heal. It's not meant to heal. It gets easier, but it doesn't heal. We have a bereavement department here, and some time ago I spoke to one of the guys who just run a course over the weekend for those who'd lost a child. And I said, tell me about it. He said, well, on the Friday afternoon, it's pretty typical. We had about 20 people in the room, couples, they'd all lost a child. And the men, some of the men have their arms folded as if to say, we shouldn't be here. It's a waste of time. There's no point. They can't give us our child back. And then he said, I stand up and I tell them how I lost my son when he was 22. And I didn't want to take my life, but I didn't want to live either. And I would just walk in the rain and cry. And my wife and I were close, but she couldn't get near to me. And he said, people will say time will heal. And I say, no, it doesn't heal. It gets easier, but it doesn't heal. And the really silly ones would say, but Peter, you've got 3 other great kids. And I'd say, no, but I want him. And people they say things like, well, he's in a better place. Or they'll use those 2 words, at least. At least you've got 3 other kids. At least you're young, you can marry again. And sometimes people don't need those answers. They just want you to be with them, cry with them, just be there. And you know, when we see somebody across the road and they've lost somebody, we think, oh, should I cross the road and speak to them? I may say the wrong thing. I would say, always cross the road. Always cross the road. And that's what I tried to do for David Oliver and Jill that day.
If I can remember correctly, you were praying, I don't know what to say, God, what do I say? And you just knocked on the door and can't remember what you actually said. It had such a profound effect on David that he then shared it, and consequently you've got the book that's just come out as well.
I remember praying with a group in Scotland probably 35 years ago, perhaps more. And one woman said, she prayed, Lord, help me do no harm today. And I can remember thinking, that's not much of a prayer. But the older I get, the more I think it's not a bad prayer. So as I went in then, I can remember praying, Lord, help me do no harm. I don't want to make it worse for these people. I just want to bless them. So help me in that.
That was it. That's what you said. Thank you. So you became a lawyer. I know that lawyering can have all sorts of facets, if that word exists, lawyering. Which part of the lawyer side did you want to major on?
Well, first of all, it was an almighty shock to me. John Loosemore came up to me when I was about 21. I just finished giving a talk and he said, I'd like you to join my law practice. I said, John, listen, I don't think I got enough qualifications and I certainly haven't got enough money for law school. He said, you'll be fine. It'll take you 5 years. You'll have to do it the long way and I'll pay for you to go to law school.
Wow.
But by the time I was 30, I was a joint senior partner of an 11-office law practice. And John and I had formed a consultancy that ran seminars for lawyers throughout the United Kingdom on how to expand a legal practice, because our practice had grown very quickly. And it began with one of the big legal publishers asking us to run a seminar. And coming home from doing that, John said, we should do this ourselves. And we used to take the Hilton Hotel on Park Lane and we'd fill the ballroom with hundreds of lawyers. And so you can imagine what a shock all that was to me. 1 minute I'm in school, coming 34th out of 34. Next I'm standing in front of hundreds of lawyers in the London Hilton on Park Lane and talking about practice management. So law was fascinating for me. I mean, we got involved in all kinds of things. I've been involved in murder trials and property stuff. But John and I spent a lot of time actually advising law practices on management and expansion right throughout the United Kingdom. We got into Europe, got into Australia. So it was a fascinating time between the time I was about 30 and 40. So we had a lot of fun doing that.
I bet you did. Just going back to the Blue Jets, if that's okay, because music is such an important part of my life. I never quite made it. I thought we were going to become the greatest band since the Beatles, but that never really happened either.
Yeah.
How close were you to maybe getting a good record contract, and who else did you play with in those times?
I came near to playing on a record because when I was 19, there was a band in Cardiff, and their rhythm guitarist, in those days, it was a lineup, was lead guitar, bass guitar, drums, and rhythm guitar.
Yeah.
And I was very bad rhythm guitarist, but they needed someone to join quickly after their rhythm guitarist left, and they let me join. I was absolute rubbish. But one day they said, we're going to London to make a record. So I was so excited, and I told my mother. She rang all my relatives. Robert's going to make a record. But it didn't go well. I remember going into the recording studios, and the producer said, okay, guys, get in the booth and go for it. Take one. And after about a minute, he said, stop. There's something wrong. And to my horror, he began to flick switches and isolate the instruments. He said, lead guitar's fine, bass fine, drums fine, me, plinkety plonk. And they kicked me off the record. So I didn't actually ever make a record, but I did get into a recording studio. But it was interesting, when I was 55, I thought it's time you'd learn to play the guitar properly. And I got myself a fancy guitar tutor, and I told him my humiliation in the recording studio. And he said to me, well, you're with me now, don't worry. So we practiced. And then he said, Rob, you're on fortnight's holiday and I'm going away for a fortnight. So you've got a month to practice. And I've been with him for a while by now. And he gave me Eric Clapton's Knocking on Heaven's Door to practice. And I gave that song everything I had. And I couldn't wait for him to come back from holiday. So when he came back, he said, okay, Rob, let's hear it. And I played it and finished, and I waited for his verdict. And honestly, I feel foolish saying it now, but I thought he might say, wow, well, I've heard Clapton, but that was amazing. What he actually said was, I can see why they kicked you off that record. And you know the sad thing about that, Martin? I never went back.
Oh.
By then, I'd been a senior partner of a big law practice. I'd spoken to multinational companies all over the world and occasionally governments. I think I'd probably written 15 books by then. But even so, I never went back. It's very easy to discourage. It was almost like school again, somebody saying you're just rubbish at this, So It's fascinating, isn't it? Even when we get older, we can be affected so dramatically. Yeah,
and the fact that I laughed, I thought was quite a funny line. But obviously, just because you think it's funny, it can actually be taken completely the wrong way, as happened there.
Well, there we are. I never went back. Do you know, when my form teacher wrote those words about me when I was 14, he's making no use of what little ability he has. I don't think he could have known what he was doing. He thought he was just writing with a pen on a piece of paper, a report card, but he wasn't. That day, he made a little box for me, and the bottom said, disgraceful. The side said no ability. The roof said no hope. And because he was a teacher, and I climbed in that box, and I lived in that box that said, Rob, you're rubbish academically for many years, too many years. And we're not meant to do that to other people. And we're not meant to live in the boxes other people make for us. And I think that happened with the guitar tutor in some ways. Now, I went on academically, I got a master's, I got a PhD. So there must have been some ability there.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, those early messages are very strong.
Because of my musical background, I've got to ask two things. What was the name of the recording studio, and what was the name of the band, please?
I can't remember the name of the recording studio. The band was called The Proclaimers.
Wow.
Not the fancy one.
It's not exactly 500 miles from Wales, is it? I was hoping you were going to say it was the Ivies, and I go, well, you know what happened to them, don't you?
No, I don't. What happened to them?
Oh, they changed the name to Badfinger.
Oh, did they? Oh, right.
Yeah, they were from Swansea, though.
How about that?
At that time, though, random in Cardiff, you had some great names coming out, didn't you? A certain Tom Jones, of course.
Tom Jones, Shirley Bassey, of course.
From Tiger Bay.
From Tiger Bay. My best mate, who was just in my office with me a minute ago, he went to see the Rolling Stones before they were famous in Cardiff Savoy Gardens, and it was half empty.
Wow.
And he also went to see the Beatles in the Capitol Centre in Cardiff. And he said, from the second they came on stage, I didn't hear a thing. It was just people screaming. I didn't hear a word. But those were fascinating times. Fascinating times, weren't they? Yeah.
Yes. I wonder just how much we can now blame social media for not having those kind of times where people were going in to make music and bands because they had nothing else to do.
Yeah, perhaps so, yeah. How interesting.
Well, let's crack on then, please, good sir. I suppose my career in broadcasting started in 1994, going to UCB, and immediately had to play some stuff from America called Focus on the Family. And then I hear Care for the Family, which is your organisation. What tie-ups, if anything, were there in the early days with focus on the family and care for the family?
We're not linked to Focus on the Family. I think they did stuff on parenting and marriage and so forth, and we did too. Basically, I think wherever you go in the world, families face the same kind of issues.
Yeah.
I've spoken in the developing world a lot, and a bit in America and so forth. And families face those kind of issues wherever they are. Somebody said to me in a radio interview the other day, "What's the greatest threat to family life today?" And I always give the same answer. It is the very modern belief that love is just a feeling, that when we stop feeling in love, we can just walk away. I was speaking to some MPs in the House of Parliament some time ago, and they looked so bored they could hardly keep their eyes open until I told them this story. A young couple came into my office. She was cradling a baby about 6 months old. And I said to this young guy, he's about 25 years old, "Why are you leaving your wife and your little girl?" He said, "Because I don't feel in love anymore. When we got married, I felt so in love, but I don't feel like that now." And I said to him, "Did nobody tell you that the feelings of love go up and down? Did nobody tell you that after the birth of a baby it can be pretty tough? You've got this challenging new guest in your home. Perhaps the sex life is not so great. Did nobody tell you sometimes you have to love, at least for a while, not just with the heart, but with the will? Did nobody ever tell you any of that stuff?" And he looked at me and said, "No, nobody told me that." And I looked at this little girl. She's 6 months old. The first man in her life is about to walk on her forever. And nobody told him that. So I think when Focus on the Family began, they were talking about those kind of issues, and we heard them doing that, and that really resonated with me. But there have been many organizations throughout the world that have done that. And as I say, wherever you go in the world, I think generally you find, well, I think always you find those same issues. Parents trying to get through as best they can. You have 2 kids, one will be compliant, one will drive you crazy. Marriages go through tough times where you don't feel in love. Those kind of things tend to hit every home at some time.
Well, we seem to have a theme every so often from previous guests, and it's not my doing. Every so often we feel as if the people that are listening are at the crossroads of life, whereby, like yourself, you're being a lawyer, they just feel as if God's saying, "Look, I want you to do something else." So what happened to you for you to suddenly think, "Do you know what? There's this thing I want to do," that ends up being care for family. And of course, what did your family think and all the emotions that have to go along with it?
Well, at the moment, I'm on tour with something called An Evening with Rob Parsons, where they recreate my living room on stage when I was a kid. And I sit in this big armchair and just basically tell stories. And I tell stories of my dad there sat every night working his way through 10 players untipped cigarettes. I talk about my mum. I talk about a homeless guy who came to live with us. And I talk about Diane. I talk about what happened after the birth of our second child, Lloyd. One day, Diane woke up. It was an autumn morning. The sun was streaming through the curtains. And she said, "Darling, I don't think I can cope anymore." And Martin, those words ushered in years of darkness for Di and I. If I thought that was going to be over that day, that week, that month, that year, I was wrong. Now, Diane was eventually diagnosed with ME. Now, that's a controversial illness, but I'm telling you, it was even more controversial then. Yeah. But whatever it was, my vibrant wife was gone. She could hardly get out of bed. And they were tough times. And I can remember talking to her after a couple of years had gone by, and she was getting a bit better. And she said, "You know what, Rob, people want to talk to me. And I don't have any clever answers for them, but they want to." And I think Diane's vulnerability and her honesty, and she's probably the most honest woman I know, give a great attraction for people. And one night she said to me, "Do you know our church has house groups on a Wednesday night?" And I said, "Sure." She said, "Well, I'd like to start one for people who are broken. They've had an emotional breakdown, or their relationships are broken down, or they've had a faith and lost it. And I'd like us to get together." And I said, "Darling, it'll be a disaster. We just depress each other." She said, "No, it'll be fine. Trust me. The only 2 gifts I can give people when they come to see me are the gift of listening and being able to say also, look, I can't understand all you're going through, but I too have cried." And so the Strugglers group was born. Every Wednesday night, people came, the broken came to the broken. We had no clever answers. We just listened and prayed. And all kinds of people came to that group. I remember opening the door one night and there was a GP there, and he said, "I've come for the Strugglers group." There were hospital consultants, the unemployed came, all kinds of people came. And fact, I was speaking in Cambridge recently, and a woman came up to me. She hugged me. She said the strugglers group changed my life. And one night we were washing the coffee mugs up after people had gone. And I said, darling, can you imagine doing this, not just to 12 people, but to hundreds, perhaps thousands of people? Rob, I'm only just hanging on by my fingernails now. I said, no, I mean, really do it. Well, she said, what do you mean, leave the law practice and start like a charity? I said, yeah. And we began to think and pray about that. And one day I did. And so Care for the Family was born. And you asked, what did my family think of it? And Di was fantastic. I think we just felt it was right. And in some ways, it was a very difficult decision. And in other ways, very easy. It was like the leaves falling off the tree in autumn. It was just that this was right for this season. And so Care for the Family was born. And one of our core values today is vulnerability. So we say to people who volunteer with us, if you've got a perfect marriage and you've got 3 perfect kids and they save their pocket money for Shakespeare study guides and they complain the church services aren't long enough and you can't wait to share your gems with the world, probably not our kind of person. We need people who cried a bit. And so vulnerability is still a core value of what we do. And that's how it began. It was born out of dark times and pain.
Wow. Well, you mentioned ME. We had a brief chat before we were recording and I gave you a very quick biography of my life. And I met my wife just as she thought she was coming out of ME when it was still considered yuppie flu.
Yeah.
When we got married, the only hospital in the UK, as far as NHS was concerned, that recognised ME was one down in Romford. And shortly after our married life had started, I had to take her down there. And they said, right, we want you in hospital for 3 months. And Alison said, can't do that. I've just got married. And they said, right, we go home for 6 months then. You have to go on a wheat-free, dairy-free, gluten-free, red meat-free diet.
Yeah.
That was the start of my married life. The only good thing that came out of that was that we found that Mexican food was okay because it was done with maize, of course. So she could eat, she could eat tortillas.
Right.
The idea was just to get all the stuff out of her body and then they could start again. So I can identify with Diane on that one.
Amazing.
How did you go about this? So you're saying, right, okay, let's go for it. The next thing is to actually do something about it. So you mentioned the strugglers group, but how did it then morph into Care for the Family that we know today?
We had been kind of talking about it, and some friends of mine had an existing charity, and they helped. They allowed Care for the Family to begin kind of as a department of their charity, and it began like that. Eventually, it became an independent charity. But they were incredibly wise and encouraging to me. And I can remember Dan and I at the very beginning, so we're going back to 1988 now, Care for the Family has been going for almost 40 years. And Dan and I went on the road together with a marriage seminar, and hundreds of people came to it. I mean, there are a lot of people doing that now, but in those days they weren't. And we began talking very openly and honestly about our relationship. And I think that's what appealed to people. And thousands of people eventually came to those seminars, and then people joined me. And to be honest with you, I'm in our headquarters now. We have almost 90 staff now, and big headquarters. We got an auditorium, that will seat almost 200 people. We got a television studio, and I look around and think, how did this happen? But it's been an incredible journey. We work in several main areas. We work in bereavement, work with parents who've lost a child, work with people who've lost a partner early in life. We work in the area of marriage and relationships and parenting. And although a lot of our constituents have a Christian faith, many don't. And so we produce resources both for the church and for those outside as well. Courses are run for local authorities as well, and police forces often take our material and put them up in their receptions and so forth. One police inspector said to me recently, he said, I put your books up in our police station and the policemen steal them, but we're glad that they steal them. And he said, some of your books are fascinating because they haven't got Bible verses all over them, but they're like the book of Esther that doesn't mention God, but they have God's fingerprints all over them. Yeah, it's been an incredible journey.
We're talking journeys. Looking back over your life to date, Rob, what have you learned so far about yourself?
I think the biggest thing I've learned is that most of us, including me, are a lot more insecure than we let on. And if we're not careful, we'll spend our lives trying to prove ourselves to people, even to prove ourselves to ourselves. So if we're church leaders, we'll be constantly talking about how many people come to our church. If we're in business, we'll be talking about how well we're doing. If we run in a charity, we'll be telling how many people we reach. But that's not much of a way to live, because ultimately you come to believe that that's how God thinks of you. R.T. Kendall, the theologian, said a fascinating thing to me some years ago. He said, Rob, you have to grasp that God is for you. It's in Romans that God is for you. Book of Romans says that. He said, God is for you when your mind is filled with certainty and your heart is plagued by doubt. He's for you when you share the faith with thousands, and he's for you when you deny him. He's for you when life's going well, and he's for you when your prayers don't seem to be answered. God is for you. And that is a remarkable thing to grasp. Somebody put it like this: nothing you do can make God love you more. Nothing you do can make him love you less. And I think I've learned, even now, that we're a lot more insecure than we think. But if we can be free of that trying to prove ourselves, then it is a true freedom, a true freedom. And as we get older, we'll see some signs that we're getting a little better at that. We'll be less concerned about meeting important people and more concerned about how we deal with the man or woman selling the big issue. We'll be less concerned with how many people listen to us and more concerned with how we deal with the few that may be. So we begin to see little indications that we're looking at life a bit differently. Yeah.
As a former train officer, we used to talk about stop going after the big case-itis, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Everybody wanted to go for that big $1 million sale.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, no, look at what's around you and go from there.
Yeah.
There must have been times, though, where you've come off stage speaking or whatever, and you go, do you know what, God, I'm just fed up. I just want to give it all up and just either go into a corner and let a rock fall on top of me or just go away from it. How many times did you have that kind of feeling?
Hardly ever.
Wow.
I can't remember feeling that. I mean, I've cried a lot. There've been lots of pain and disappointment and failure, and yeah. But I've been privileged. I've loved everything I've done. I'm blessed. Even now, I just can't believe, that I have the opportunity to do things I can. So I loved being law. People say to me, "Did you not like the law?" I loved the law, and I've loved what I do now. So no, I've never felt I wish I could give it all up. But there have been lots of dark times and lots of tears and lots of pain. But I've not felt that. The Bible says, run with patience the race set before you, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher. There's the race set before you. Your race, Martin's not my race. They're different. We're different. I can't run your race and you can't run mine. And that race is sometimes difficult. But it's a marathon. It's not a 100-yard sprint. But no, I can't honestly say I felt that. I've often felt disappointed with myself, plenty of times. I wrote a book some years ago called Getting Your Kids Through Church Without Them Ending Up Hating God. And I said, if you're going to have to get your kids ready for 3 disappointments that are going to face them in life. They're going to go all their lives following Jesus. You've got to get them ready for 3 big disappointments. Number 1, with themselves. They'll let the Lord down. And that's why I love the parable of the prodigal son. I've said to my kids, whatever you do, you can always come home. Secondly, other people. Your Christian heroes may fall. We've seen a spate recently of well-known Christian names fall, and that's disappointing. And other people will let us down, or people in church will be nasty to us, or other Christians will not understand us. And thirdly, we'll become disappointed with God sometimes. We prayed hard that our friend would be healed of cancer, and they were for a while, but then we cried by a graveside. And we'll be disappointed with God. And I've been through all those experiences. But I can honestly say I've never felt I wanted to give up what I do. Yeah.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? It's a matter of interest.
I really don't know. I suppose it's because I feel that this is what I'm meant to be doing.
Yeah.
There's a line in a very old hymn. The first line is, my song is love unknown, my Saviour's love to me, love to the loveless shown that they might lovely be. But the last line is, this is my friend. It's speaking about Jesus, but this is my friend in whose sweet praise I all my life should gladly spend. And what I can say is that with lots of failure and lots of letting him down, and that all my life I've known him as my friend. This is my friend. And my friend has walked with me through dark times and difficult times. And so it's not been a case of just wanting to give up. I'm not saying that would be wrong if some people felt like that. But for me, I've not felt that. But I think it's because I've known the strength and the help and the understanding and the forgiveness and the grace sometimes that we need from that friend.
For those that are listening today, firstly, are thinking, do you know what? The reason I come to these podcasts is because it's off-grid and you might understand more about what I'm going through. So if people are at that crossroads of life whereby they're saying, do you know what? I'm just so fed up on everything, I just want to give up, either in the job or maybe in their Christian faith or in their Christian ministry. What advice could you give them?
Well, it might be right for them to give their job up. That might be right for them. And but the thing about giving up faith, I think very often when I meet people who've given up on faith, they rarely talk to me about some great intellectual problem they've had or academic difficulty. It's generally they become disillusioned with the church, disillusioned with other Christians, or their prayers have not been answered in the way they want. Do you know, some years ago, I came across a guy called David Works, and I spoke to him on the phone because I was telling his story and I wanted to check I got it right. And he came out of church here just outside of Colorado Springs some years ago with his little family. And it was a winter's day. And they made their way across the ice puddles and to his van, a Toyota Sienna people carrier. And his daughter was outside the car when suddenly he saw a man dressed in black coming in, who began shooting at them. He screamed at his little family to get down, and he was hitting the hip, and his daughter was hitting the chest. And he says, I remember her saying to me, Daddy, I've been hit. And he said she had a white T-shirt on, and this round blood was growing in her T-shirt. And I said, darling, I can't get you. And she said, that's all right, Daddy. And his other child, I think, was hit as well. And he was taken to the hospital. The young man was eventually shot by security forces. And he said, I'm lying in hospital. He said, no, he said, I'm lying in the car park with the bullets flying around me. And I say, God, what is going on? We're a missionary family. We're about to go overseas to serve you overseas. And I felt God say to me, David, we're not going over this and we're not going under it. We're going through it. And he said, I'm lying in bed that night. My daughter had died by then. And another daughter had died. She got hit as well. And he thought, how could we possibly lose two kids in one day? I'm not going anywhere. He said, I feel like Peter. Where would I go? You alone have the words of eternal life. And you know, this wasn't Disney World. He screamed with pain and anger and grief. But he was powerful talking to him, because I came to realize that if we're going to go on following Jesus, we're going to go on following him, even though we have to go through things and not around them. And unless we do that, we will give up the minute somebody offends us or takes us off the preaching rota or the flower rota or some little spat over theology or doctrine. But if we realize that we're meant to lean on God. Do you know, sometimes people say to me, Rob, your faith in God is a crutch. And I say to them, you're probably right. But I wasn't meant to make it on my own. I was meant to lean. And I think that's an important thing to hang on to.
Thank you. It reminded me when you were showing that of a very good, well-known leader of a ministry. And because of what was going on in the ministry with all the shenanigans of power, of people trying to get their own way and stuff, he would go home every night and it was his wife's job to listen and then just dust him off and kick him out the door the following day just to get through it, as you're saying. I would have thought that your wife, if she was here now, she'd be able to share something similar. That was part of her job role as well, just to dust you off and kick you back out the following day.
Yeah, Diane has been brilliant, and she's a great one for bringing you down to earth if I take myself a bit too seriously. And she's been incredible, a rock really, and sounding board. But you know, the truth is, whether it's a wife, a husband, a friend, we're not meant to make it on our own. But somebody said to me some years ago, he heard this old Pentecostal American pastor speaking. He was talking about men. He was speaking to a men's group. He said, every man needs three men in his life. He needs a Barnabas to encourage him. He needs a Timothy to pass the faith on to. And he needs a Paul to mentor him. And Martin, at that time in my life, I had some Barnabases and I had a couple of Timothys, but I didn't have a Paul. And I found my Paul probably 30 years ago. And he's not much older than me, but he's a whole lot wiser and certainly a whole lot godlier. And sometimes I go to him and I share things with him I'm ashamed of or afraid of, and he prays for me. And we need each other, whether it's a wife, a husband, a friend, whether we're single or married. We're not meant to make it on our own.
Thank you. I did mention at the beginning that there's a book called A Knock at the Door, which featured heavily on the BBC website over Christmas, in fact. It's a fascinating story about how you welcome somebody in and they stayed for not just 1 week, but for several years. I'd love people to go and buy the book and read it. I don't want to talk about that, but how did the BBC get involved, and what's been the subsequent feedback on the book and the fact that it was on the website throughout Christmas Day on the BBC?
Well, what happened was Dan and I we hadn't been married very long. We didn't have kids. There's a knock on our door. There's a homeless man standing there. And we invite him in for a meal, and he stays that night with us, and he never leaves. He lived with us for 45 years. He died about 5-6 years ago. And after he died, I began to tell this story. I'd not told it very much before, to be honest. And wherever I spoke, whether it was social workers or politicians or medics, they said, we've never heard a story like this. And so I wrote the story in the book, and Davina McCall got me on her podcast, and she asked me about it, and the book just took off. And then on Christmas Day, my friend texted me and said, have you seen the main BBC website? And I said, no. And he said, well, look at it. And I look at the main BBC website, and it has 3 sections. The top half is of the King and Queen go to church. The bottom quarter is the Pope delivering his first Christmas address. And the right hand next to the Pope is filled with Ronnie Lockwood, the homeless guy, sat at my kitchen table. 9 million people read that story. Yeah, in fact, we were called into the BBC Christmas night to speak. It was on the main news. Main news, for goodness sake. I mean, flipping heck. So it's all been a bit of a shock, really, and the book's called A Knock at the Door. But Ronnie was a remarkable man, a remarkable man. When he'd been with us a short time, he got a job as a dustman. And Dan said to me, make sure he gets to work on time. So I used to drop him off at the dust yard and go into work a little early. I'd get home at night and he'd be smiling. I said to him one night, Ronnie, when I get home, you're always smiling. What amuses you so much? He said, Robin, he spent all his life in care when he was a kid. He didn't have a family of his own, really. He said, when you drop me off, the other men say, who's that brings you to work in the fancy car? And I say, oh, that's my solicitor. And we thought a lot about that, Dan and I. I don't think he was proud of being taken to work by a lawyer, but I think it was this. He never had a mother take him first day of school. He never had a father say when he was 11, how'd it go in the big school today, son? And Martin, I've come to believe we all need somebody at the gate. No matter how powerful we are or prestigious, we all need somebody at the gate. And so we learned a lot from Ronnie Lockwood, but he did live with us. He was there before the kids came, and he was there long after they'd left with kids of their own. So he was part of our family.
It's an amazing story. Well, looking back on your life to date, if there was just one takeaway that you have learnt about God himself and you would like to share with us, what is it, please?
I think it was said of Jesus that he didn't need anybody to tell him about men and women. He knew people's hearts. He knew. And I think the incredible thing about God, and it's very hard for us to grasp, because we spend most of our lives proving that we're worth loving, whether it's academically or in sport or business or work or what have you. The thing about God is here is somebody who knows us better than we know ourselves and still loves. That's really, really hard to grasp. You know, some mornings, Martin, I wake and it's far too early, it's still dark. And a voice says in this year, Rob, if people really knew you, they wouldn't come and hear you speak. They wouldn't buy your books. You're a bit of a hypocrite. You don't pray enough. You don't do this. I get that, but once a month. But if I'm fortunate, I hear a voice in that other ear that says, I know you. I know you better than you know yourself. I'm not as impressed with the books and speaking events as you appear to be, but I still love you. And that phrase I mentioned at the beginning of our interview, nothing you do can make me love you more. Nothing you do can make me love you less. And this is the remarkable thing of the character of God, I think. This really is love.
Rob, final question then, good sir. Thank you so much for everything you've shared. It's a drum roll time. This is where I ask you who your Christian hero is.
It was the guy that took me to that little Bible study when I was a kid. He had nothing going for him. No, you wouldn't want him on your podcast. No church would want him to preach. I wouldn't want him to run a seminar for care of the family. He could hardly put 2 words together. But he loved kids. And I think he and Margaret, his wife, must have woken up one morning and thought, you know, darling, we don't seem to have very much going for us. We haven't got any money. We haven't got any academic qualifications. We can't have kids of our own right now. But we got 2 rooms in my mother's house. I think I could teach kids a bit of the Bible. I think if we get a couple of bits of hardboard and a table tennis bat, we could play table tennis with them. And if we save our money, we can buy them fish and chips, perhaps. Let's give it a shot. And Arthur changed my life. And that's the test, to begin with what we have. We all say, oh God, I would serve you if only I had this or if only I had that. But they began with what they had. And I think that is heroic. They weren't perfect, but Arthur Tovey would be my Christian hero.
Wow. And what happened to him later in life?
He worked as a technician in a kind of technical college in those days. Yeah. I talk about him in Knock at the Door. There's a picture of him in the book.
Oh, great. Fantastic. Thank you. Well, I love hearing answers when somebody is just personal and we've never heard of before. So thank you for flying the flag for Arthur Tovey. Rob Parsons, thank you so much for what you've shared today. It's been absolutely fantastic. And as you say, you're in the middle of your tour and you've got other dates to go as well. So I'm sure all the audiences are going to be enjoying the stories that you're going to be sharing with them. Thank you so much for joining us today, Rob.
Well, thanks, Martin. Lovely to talk to you. Thank you so much.
No, you're welcome. Cheers. God bless. And if you haven't already hit the like and subscribe button, please do. Next time on Off Grid Christianity.
The main thing that we got involved with was making films about it. We interviewed people who were suffering from mental health issues and illustrated their interviews that were shown, in churches. They were made available. On a personal note, my own children suffer. My eldest has mild autism.
Mm-hmm.
My grandson has autism, and my youngest son has autistic traits, and he has ADHD and various other things as well. So, and I was a single mother when my boys were growing up. My husband left when they were 8 and 10, so I was a single mother to these teenage boys who were trying to make their way through life with these mental health issues, and that was really tough. There was a lot of anger. Sometimes the house was a bit like a war zone. My youngest son in particular was quite an angry teenager. I'm so grateful for the church family at that time, actually, because by that time I'd gone away from the church when I was younger and I came back to it. And at that stage, so I had a church family when I became a single parent, and I just don't know what I would have done without it, Martin. They were so supportive. So I do have this personal connection with mental health and what it could do to young children.
So please join me with our special guest, the author of a brand new book, Following the Sun, Jackie Moradian. Until then, cheerio.